Hello, everyone. I'm Rami Banks, Director of Operations for Waters Foundation Systems Thinking Group. Welcome to our webinar, K-3 Integration of Knowledge and Ideas. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to have people from across the United States and around the world participating today. As you may know, the Waters Foundation is focused on delivering academic and lifetime benefits to students through the effective application of systems thinking, concepts, habits, and tools in classroom instruction and school improvement. We do this by providing training, coaching, and support services to school districts and teachers from across the country and around the world. We are very pleased to host this webinar, which is part of a series offered through the Soul Education Partnership as part of a 2-year project funded by the Hewlett Foundation to explore how systems thinking tools and approaches have been incorporated into lessons and curricula used to help students meet some of the Common Core state standards. The additional webinars in this series will take place throughout the month and are listed on our website. You can also find information on other upcoming events by visiting our website at watersfoundation.org. The calendar of events is located in the professional development section of the site. Many of our training sessions are open to the public, so if you're interested in attending one of these, feel free to sign up via our site. Also, if you have not already done so, you can register on our website to download a variety of resources. You'll find examples, lesson plans, videos, lesson ideas, and more in our resource section, and you can also access our online WebEd learning modules. Before we get started with the webinar, I'd just like to cover a few logistics. You should see on your screen 4 windows. The large one on the left is the main window for the presentation. On the right is a webcam which will remain off for most of the session. There is also a Q&A window. If you have questions, please use this window to type your questions. We will monitor this and try to answer all the questions. Please note that answered questions will be visible to all the participants. Also, our facilitator will pause periodically to answer questions as they come up for the benefit of the whole group. Below the question and answer window is a polling window that initially says, please share an example of a behavior over time graph from your own classroom practice. At specific times during the session, the presenter will encourage you to share your ideas and strategies here. Again, anything you type in this section will be visible to everyone. For any given poll, you may respond one time. One final reminder, you should have all received an email earlier this week with a link to the session handouts. If you have not downloaded the handouts, please do so. The link to Google Drive is posted in the Q&A window, and you can also click on the files in the file window to download them. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator today, Sharon Marlin, Education Director, Deeper Learning through Common Core Standards with the Waters Foundation. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Rami. I'm going to go ahead and share the webcam here for just a minute so that I can add my own word of welcome to our participants today. It's great to have you. It's great to see familiar faces, names I know well, and to see some new people in addition to those friendly faces. I also would like to say that it's a real privilege to be the voice of this Deeper Learning project for about 18 months. We have been working with teachers from around the country to do exactly what Rami said, to see how we can best support teachers in the implementation of the standards. And so with that, I'm going to turn this back off to allow you to focus on some of the ideas that these teachers have come up with and share those as we go through. We're going to talk a lot today about connections and the importance of making connections. So before we begin, I'd also like to say that I know that some of you are watching alone and some of you are having the benefit of some collegial learning and that you've brought some colleagues together. So if you are in a group, this would be a great time to have some conversation. And if you're working alone, I'd encourage you to, on the back of one of those downloaded handouts, just to take some notes and use this as a time of personal reflection. But I'd like you to start is thinking about an aha moment. That time when you had an understanding or insight that really changed the way that you thought about something. Maybe you were learning something new, maybe you were attending a presentation, but you made a real connection, an aha moment. Take just a minute to identify that and to get it down either by sharing it with someone that you're in a room with right now or writing it on a piece of paper. Thank you very much for doing that and for engaging in some of these activities as we go through this session today. Just as an example, hopefully representative of some of the things you choose, sometimes those connections are transfer of situations. For example, a lot of times I will learn how to do something on my iPad and be able to transfer it to my iPhone. I think these kind of aha moments or connections are one of the reasons that integrated or interdisciplinary approaches can be so effective with students. It's one of the techniques that we see superb teachers doing, is being able to help students make connections to the curriculum or the content that they're delivering to their personal lives. And those connections are going to be an important part of our session today. So in the next hour that we spend together, here are some of the things that I'm hoping that you will take from this session. First, we're going to spend a little time, and many of you have been working with the Common Core standards in your area, named a variety of different things across the country, but these standards about what students should know and be able to do in different formats. But there are some keys to the actual structure of the way the standards are developed that I think are very useful in teaching those standards to students, and we're going to spend a few minutes looking at that today. Primarily the tool we're going to use, and this has been, it's an introductory webinar with one of the intentions, and the Hewlett Grant and the Hewlett Project is that we support teachers in scaling up efforts. So where we have had teachers who have been doing this work, this is a way for them to share these tools with their colleagues. And so in the hour that we're going to spend, we're really going to focus on behavior over time as a teaching strategy. And we're being so specific as to say addressing reading information and reading literature standards 7, 8, and 9, which is the integration of knowledge. And we'll look at those specific standards. And then what is typically people's favorite part of a webinar, viewing samples of student work in order to help you make some connections to your own curriculum. So we know that one of the things that good teachers, good thinkers do is that they consciously make meaningful connections within and between systems. And so we're going to look at how to link the ideas in the standards with the tools of systems thinking so that we can help students, help children lead to new learning and discoveries and being innovative in the thinking that they do. Part of the idea for really connecting these ideas to making connections comes from Ellen Galinsky's book, Mind in the Making, where she says, learning came alive for me and still does in those moments when I can see connections among different facts, findings, or concepts. And as I was reading, making connections is one of the 7 dispositions that Ellen references in her book. And as I was rereading that chapter in preparation for our time together today, it really did bring to mind that image of a Navajo or a Native American weaver taking those threads and turning them into a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful work of art. So to introduce the tool, and again, familiar to many of you, and so I'm going to ask Anne, who's also helping us, to go ahead and put that poll window up so that as I'm going over behavior over time graph basics, if you're one of our experienced practitioners and using these tools regularly in your classroom, this would be a great time for you to start to respond to that poll and to go ahead and show us or share with the other participants in this webinar some of the ways that you have used behavior over time graphs in your classroom. Now, some of them you may actually see a few slides from now, but we'd love to hear from you if you have some good ideas about that. But a behavior over time graph is a specific form of a line graph. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, always shows time. And in many of the examples that we're going to look at today, that time is denoted as events in a story, from the beginning, the middle, to the end. It can also be a specific measure of time in science, seconds, minutes. When looking at school culture and issues of administration, often that time axis looks like a school year, 5 school years, 10 school years, to really examine patterns and trends. So it's a line graph with time as the x-axis, and the vertical axis, or the y-axis, is the variable. It's something that's changing. It's an amount of, a quantity of, it's something that changes over time. Again, that can be done as a very specific measure, an amount of water measured in milliliters, or it can be a perception. How high is your stress at a point in the school year? How low is your energy? How much satisfaction are you feeling at your job right now? So those are the basic components of a behavior over time graph. Such a simple tool, but what we see over and over is in the hand of a skillful teacher who asks really good questions, this very basic graph tool can lead to some very tremendous achievement on the part of students. So for those of you who are new, we're going to do a really quick practice. The time on this axis is 6 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. in the evening. And the variable that's described in the story on the left is temperature in Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit degrees is the variable. So starting with 0 at the bottom and going to 100 degrees on the scale. The story, and you can read it there on the screen, the day started out cold at around 40 degrees. Yes, I live in Tucson, so 40 degrees is really cold, and warmed up slowly until the temperature reached about 75 before cooling off throughout the afternoon and evening. So again, on a piece of paper, if you've got one in front of you, or just in your mind, picture what the line might look like that tells the story, keeping in mind where the temperature starts, around 40 chilly degrees, heating up until a little afternoon, and then cooling off through the afternoon and evening. In your mind, that line probably looks something like that. And so what you see on the left is a story that represents that temperature trend throughout the day. Not too many more weeks in Tucson, and our temperature, that will be a pretty exact rendition of what our day looks like here in terms of temperature. So that's a very straightforward graph. There's a pretty consistent answer or response that would come to that kind of a graph that would match that kind of a story. One more practice so that all of us can get the feel of creating a behavior over time graph. So here we have an x-axis that represents a semester, traditional school semester, August to December, first semester of the school year for most of us. And I just chose as the variable level of energy. I was thinking about teacher level of energy, but you might prefer to draw the story to represent your students. But again, just draw a quick line that you think represents your personal, the teachers in your building, the level of energy of teachers from August through December. And I'm going to give you a minute to actually physically draw that line. Now, for this particular story, we actually have a little bit of research that tells us at the beginning of the school year, teachers have been hopefully rejuvenated, rested through their summer vacation. So they start out with a pretty good level of energy. It may even increase. Not the tool I want. Gonna try that again. So they start out at a pretty high level. I'll try one more time. And it may even go up a little bit as students come in and they're reunited with students that they know. And then things are going along, but then the work, the reports, the parent conferences, late night for open house may cause a decrease. And actually, in some districts, this may even be the reason that we've seen fall breaks, because we know, looking at teachers' level of energy, that they need some time to rejuvenate. Probably doesn't come all the way back up to summer, going down again around the holidays, and then with the anticipation of a lengthy break at winter, that line could increase. Now, unlike the temperature of the day, which was probably a pretty consistent story, when we get to talking about levels of personal energy, there could be a host of factors that would make your story very different. And that's where the critical thinking comes for students. When we begin to look at events, at perceptions, at pieces of literature, students can have a very different story to tell. And the behavior over time graph is a great tool for them to do that. Before we look further at the applications of behavior over time graph and Common Core standards, I want to just ask you to think briefly about the structure of the standards themselves, particularly in reading and language arts, English language arts standards as they're termed. We see that all the standards start with college and career ready standards. So we have a description of what a student who has been part of the pre-K-12 system of education in a given school or district should be able to know and do at the end of their college career. And in the case of reading an informational text, those 10 standards are divided by key ideas and details, standards 1 through 3, the craft and structure of the text, standards 4, 5, and 6, the integration of knowledge, where we will be focusing today, standards 7, 8, and 9. And then standard 10 simply deals with increasing the complexity of the text. This is really significant because for those of you that may be familiar with some of our other tools, you know that the structure really represents the iceberg. And one of the reasons that we use an iceberg is to look more deeply beyond the key ideas and details. And we believe that the learning and the leverage happens at those levels, at those standards that fall below key ideas and details. Another thing that we know in traditional reading programs and programs that are not so clearly articulated with what we really want students to be able to do in language and literacy, that sometimes those questions, those approaches are focused much more heavily on the tip of the iceberg, less on looking at the craft and how authors put together their piece, and certainly less on asking students to make a hypothesis about a text and to really focus on integration of knowledge and to support their opinion with evidence. And hopefully, as we look at some of these examples today, we will have an opportunity to see and to make connections to how the structure of the standards and the use of the tools can promote deep critical thinking on the part of our students. So this is a behavior over time graph for the story Abiyoyo, about a little boy and his father who live in a village that is terrorized by a monster. And so you see in this story the first 3 events as this particular group of students has retold this story. The people are they have a sad face. They are scared. They're afraid of the monster. But due to the clever and courageous actions of the boy and his father, the monster is led out of town, and there's a relief and a happiness on the part of the people in the village. So the behavior over time graph allows students to identify when there's fear, when there's sadness, and how that changes to relief when there's a critical action on the part of the protagonist in this particular story. That simple graph is very significant in a number of ways. If you think about many of the familiar stories that we read to and tell our children, that pattern where there's an attempt to solve a goal or a problem and the character tries something and is unsuccessful until eventually there's the change. One of my favorite examples is the little red hen. Nobody wants to help her gather the mill. Nobody wants to help her grind the wheat. Nobody wants to help her bake the bread, but all of her friends are happy to come and eat. And that pattern repeats itself. So when we think about it, and this is bumping up to standard 5 that you see written on this slide, recognizing common types of text. At the most basic level, one of the things that behavior over time graphs can do for early readers, for early language learners, is to help them be very confident in identifying this pattern, or what some reading authorities would call a sense of intertextual awareness about that particular text. Children who've had a lot of rich literacy experiences coming into school do that very automatically. For some other children, the graph is very helpful in developing that intrinsic understanding of story. And that's the reason that the craft and structure section of the Common Core Standards is there, so that as teachers, we have the opportunity to very deliberately help students find features and patterns and structure in text that helps them comprehend and understand what they're reading. But to move on to that integrating knowledge, this simple graph also helps with describing the relationships. In this case, a very direct correlation between illustrations. Sometimes students draw them, sometimes teachers mock them up in different ways from the actual text, but a direct correlation between the event and, again, the change, what's significant, what's moving that plot line or creating the structure of the story. And then at the kinder level for this reading literature standard, that final knowledge and integration standard says, with prompting and support, compare and contrast the adventures and experiences of characters in familiar stories. What we have found over time at the Waters Foundation, using these tools for years with young children in story, and it proved to be very true with the teachers in our Deeper Learning Project, who our K-3 teachers looked specifically at literature and language standards, and found that students' ability to retell, to remember, to share the experiences are significantly enhanced by the use of this particular tool. In work that I know in a number of schools where classes trade graphs, students in different classes where perhaps they hadn't even heard a particular story read, the understanding of the graph and the visual nature of the tool allows them to tell a story oftentimes that they're not even familiar with. And another thing that we hear repeatedly and was borne out in the work that we did in the recent Hewlett project is that students, these graphs can come back. A graph that was made in September, a teacher reintroduces to a class in March and finds that the students still have great recall of a particular story. So this is an example I use a lot. It comes from a preschool classroom. You notice the milk jug lids as a way to make this particular activity more kinesthetic for students, but it's an incredible example of the power of this simple tool in the hand of a gifted teacher to really deepen students' comprehension and get to those 7 and 8 objectives. So this particular slide is that same idea in words instead of in pictures, where you really see slides 7 and 9, standard 7 and standard 9, and then you see just a brief explanation that when children are able to tell the story of the line, they are in fact describing the relationship between the illustration and key story events. And you will see some more examples later where multiple lines and colors compare experiences of different characters. So it's particularly if you look at Standard 9 as it goes up through the grade levels and ultimately to that college and career ready standard, what you see is it is a lot about comparing texts and comparing the perceptions of characters within a text. And again, this particular tool, the behavior over time graph, is very powerful for that as well. So we looked at Kinder. This is a third grade standard, and this moves from reading literature to reading information. We know one of the things that's called for in Common Core standards is a greater emphasis on informational text. In no way does it suggest the exclusion of literary text, only being cognizant that students also need the skill of reading for information. And we know that using information gained from words to demonstrate understanding can be greatly augmented through the use of the visual tools of systems thinking. Another oft-used example for us, this one from a biography. Students had done research on famous people. This particular one is on John F. Kennedy. And I think the question that this teacher asked really speaks to the depth of understanding that can be promoted through the use of this tool. After they had completed their research, had read multiple sources about their famous person, the teacher asked them to choose one word, one variable that really reflected the legacy of that particular person. So just making a determination about what was going to go on the y-axis, one simple question, easy for a teacher to look at and get real-time assessment information about, demonstrates a lot of understanding on the part of the student for the research that they've been doing. And then it's always kind of fun to see students' perceptions. Here, you know, this student saw John F. Kennedy having some courage or a lot of courage throughout his life. And I remember specifically the student saying, you know, it didn't take a lot of courage for him to go to Harvard because his whole family had gone to Ivy League universities. They were well educated. And it doesn't take a lot of courage to get married because he was in love. But some of his other acts, you know, commanding the destroyer and being president during the civil rights movement, now that took a fair amount of courage. So again, just a good, great representation of this student's thinking and a clear picture that these tools work in literature and informational text. Also, that third grade standard, Standard 8, described the logical connection between sentences, paragraphs, comparison, cause, effect, and sequence. And taken in consideration with standards 3, 4, and 5 on structure, systems thinking helps students understand that text structure so they can make those connections more explicit. We go into a couple more examples, and this is also where I'm hoping to share some of your ideas. So if you haven't had a chance to put your idea in that poll, please do so. I've got a couple in there, and I'll ask Rami to share those in just a minute. This is a behavior over time graph. It is from a piece of literature. It's from Winn-Dixie. And I specifically included this because here this particular class was tracking Opal's response to the events in that particular story. But you see some extra writing and some extra illustrations. Here students added some evidence from the text. Some of those are where they actually picked evidence, and some of the drawings you see represented the connections that they made. And it's a nice way that systems thinking tools integrate. We're able to connect with other methods. This particular illustration is in a classroom where Debbie Miller's text-to-text, text-to-self, text-to-world connections were very important, very much a part of this particular teacher's instruction, and so that can be represented with the behavior over time graph as an organizational support. Now again, something I hear as I talk with teachers about standards is that the evidence portion, that the asking for evidence from students somehow precludes them making text-to-self connections. And personally, I think that's not true at all, that it's about looking for meaningful connections within text, and those include text-to-self connections. So Rami, why don't you go ahead and share with us, if you would, the two responses that we have to the poll about examples from teachers of their use of behavior over time graphs in the classroom.
Yes, our first example is a new teacher's comfort level the first year of teaching.
Okay.
And I am having a hard time pulling up the second one here.
I see the level of difficulty of a particular task or assignment. And I think we're going to talk about that very specifically here in just a minute. And you're right, the one in the middle, tracking a classroom resource such as markers over time. So thank you. Thank you for those examples. And again, I think the tool is powerful for a number of reasons, one of which is that there are a pretty limitless number of applications that teachers have found. This example comes right out of our cohort. And here, another familiar story, The Kissing Hand by Audrey Penn. And so this was a first grade teacher introducing this concept for students, introducing the Behavior over Time graph tool. And just Chester's happiness, you may recall that he's very timid and afraid about going off to school. And then his mom puts that kiss in his hand that gives him strength and encouragement. And by the end, he is very happy. I know another preschool teacher who does a similar concept with Llama Llama Mrs. Mama. And she tells the story that throughout the year, her students go back to that particular behavior over time graph in order to sort of self-soothe and be able to comfort themselves as they go through. Here's another one from several years ago. This one specifically to illustrate the comparison idea. It's the tortoise and the hare and their level of persistence. So you see that the tortoise is in orange, starts out pretty strong, but his persistence weakens. You could also do a line with the tortoise's level of persistence and then his level of distractibility, and you can see some interesting contrast there. When we think about these two line graphs and the standard 8 and 9 that really speak specifically about comparing and contrasting, at the Waters Foundation, we have looked closely at how our tools and habits relate to Marzano's 9 instructional strategies. Most of you probably recall a number of years ago when Marzano did his meta-analysis and said, what are the strategies that when applied in a classroom have significant effect on student achievement? And the number one, the strongest correlation was to similarities and differences. And so for many of our tools, give students the ability to build their skill in that particular skill of identifying similarities and differences. But the behavior over time graph, when applied to literature, is particularly strong in that as well. So again, here's that standard in standard 9 in kindergarten in both information and literature. And we know that, again, the tools are particularly useful. So we've looked at the structure of the standards. I do want to call attention to this is sort of the framework, if you will, for much of our work at the Waters Foundation. And systems thinking brings together visual strategies, auditory strategies, that speaking and listening, developing skills. Academic discussion is a very important part of the standards, and that has always been a set of skills that we have consciously developed in helping teachers deliver these benefits to students. And then there's the kinesthetic component as well. So again, strong correlation to what we're doing there with what we're doing with the standards. Now it's your turn. I want you to experience a behavior over time graph and a piece of text. So hopefully you have downloaded the passage, Fire, Fire. You may know the Gail Gibbons book, Fire, Fire in the City. And you are probably also aware that Appendix B of the Common Core Standards actually gives a number of sample texts and actually passages. So I know teachers are often concerned about materials and where are we going to get materials for the text. Well, actually, Appendix B is a good source. It is not a BLN list. Nothing is required. Again, a common misconception about the standards, but it's a great source, a great place for teachers to start. So I'm going to give you just a minute to look at Fire, Fire. And if you have downloaded that, you will see at the bottom there's a behavior over time graph that sort of a mock-up of the template, the primary template that you have. So read the passage, set up your behavior over time graph. This is a really important step. I'd like you to choose your first event, your last event, and then the middle three. 5 events. There's a host of reasons for that. But the first and last really speaks to a connection to another piece of research-based pedagogy, cognitive process of instruction, that tells us when students have boundaries, that first event, the last event, and then they decide on the middle 3, cognitively, that helps with their skill of summary, can be easily reinforced in a behavior over time graph. Draw the line. If you're not alone, or if you're alone and you talk to yourself frequently, which I do, feel free to say it out loud, but please tell the story of your line to someone. That's an important step. It's a really important step for students to be able to verbalize. Again, the Common Core, there's speaking and listening standards, there's reasons, particularly students learning English, that they need to verbalize. Those of us that are auditory learners need to verbalize, and these tools are a natural extension for teachers to be able to do that. And then notice there on the reflection, what evidence can you offer from the text to support your perception of the level of danger, which is what I'm asking you to graph. I did choose to provide you with that as part of this activity. And then Anne has already replaced the poll with those reflection questions. So when you've made your graph and done some reflection, if there's something you'd like to enter in that box, that will also be important for the other participants on the webinar, and that will be also a great way for me to know that it's time to move on when I see several reflections in that poll. So I'm going to stop talking, let you read and think, and I'll be watching that poll box to know when it's time. All right, so you've had a couple minutes. I'm sure most of you have read the passage. Hopefully you've committed a line to your graph. It's really an important step because, we see this a lot with adults and sometimes with students. When you draw the line that tells the story, it is a complete assessment of your understanding of the passage. Now, when we think about good formative assessment practices for teachers, that's a really, really important thing. But sometimes as adults, and if we're using these tools as part of school culture, school climate, that can be a really risky thing to put that out. And I know that it's difficult to be thinking and reflecting and typing that out to share at the same time. But I'm going to also encourage you to go ahead and submit something to that poll so I know you're ready to move on. And while, again, I'm going to those reflection questions before I move the slide. How did this graph influence your thinking or your understanding of the story? What evidence can you offer from the text to support your perception of the level of danger at various points in the story? So I certainly did the activity myself as well. And again, I think a part of the assessment here for teachers and the way that I designed this particular practice was really to look at what events the student selects. So I started the towel that starts the fire and ended with the fire being under control. So clearly there was risk as soon as the fire started. It became more menacing as the fire crews arrived. And I can go back to the text. In the 5th paragraph, it said the fire engines arrived. The fire is bigger now. So this is a 2nd grade passage, 2nd grade standard, pretty obvious to us as adults, but a clear way to help students connect evidence to their thinking. What I've seen some teachers do is actually ask students to write right on the graph at the line, to write the evidence itself to help them document that and make it very visual. And then again, my 4th event, firefighters battle the blaze, break holes in the roof. And again, the text explains to us there is less danger now. So very directly from the text, I can give evidence why my line is going down. And then finally, the fire is under control, a direct quote from the text. Thinking carefully about the passage. Now, this is a 2nd grade passage, and it is very simple. But actually, I had to do a little research. I consulted my own private firefighter about the stem line, and what exactly is that? And again, it's out of my realm of experience, but from large industrial or apartment-type buildings, it is actually a system within the building itself where firemen can get water. So even in a simple text, there can be lots of ideas for students to explore. I don't think we have any poll responses at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. And I know that Anne and Rami are continuing to encourage you to use the Q&A if you have questions or want to contribute to this webinar. That's a really important piece, but I definitely have some more things I want to share with you before our time is up. So in addition, with the Hewlett Grant, we have a lot of our districts that have looked at the social emotional learning, SEL connections, between the standards and the work. And so some of those are equally explicit. You see here a quote from the Triple Focus, which is a recently publication by Daniel Goleman and Peter Senge. Naming emotions accurately helps children be clearer about what is going on inside, essential both to making clear-headed decisions and to managing emotions throughout life. Getting it wrong can throw children off track. So Daniel makes that assertion about the importance of emotions. And here you see, you may be familiar with the book Big Al, about a fish that by fish standards is not very attractive, and he's very large, so he scares all the little fish and doesn't have any friends. And he tries a number of things, and you see the student listed those events as her behavior over time graph, and he goes from very, very sad when he has no friends, and then he actually rescues the fish. The little fish get caught in a net, but because he's so big and so strong, he's able to break the net and free the fish, and so he's very happy at the end of his story. One of the things that's an important caution, and there's also a handout about 2 tips for behavior over time graphs. One of those tips is that you always are careful to identify just one variable that's changing. So in this case, it's that feeling of happiness and sadness. But you see this student used discouraged and encouraged as part of her gradation or variation on that particular emotion. So when we think about being able to name emotions accurately, one specific way you can do that is in helping students develop the why. Now, in the example of fire, I was very specific about the y-axis, and I gave that to you because I wanted you to be thinking about events and looking for evidence. So those are decisions that you need to make as a teacher. And again, as I said at the very beginning, the tool is so simple, but the power is in how teachers choose to use that tool and the decisions that they make about which parts they provide students and which parts in different lessons they let students choose to do. And that's also very reflective of the standard. One more on the example of the social emotional learning connections. This was a child's response to the Maya Angelou poem Life Doesn't Frighten Me at All. And in creating this y-axis, this student tells her personal story, and you see that she is paralyzed with fear at the beginning, and that's because the door closes and her room is dark, and she was very afraid of the dark. And it goes all the way down to not afraid or kind of afraid, terrified, scared, and she's able to tell her story about how she overcame that fear of the dark by telling the story of her line, and then you see her illustrations across the bottom. So again, can meet all the standards and be working on those important social emotional skills at the same time. Here's another one of our preschool examples. You see that it's not the exact pattern of not good, here mom is happy and then worried, or not worried and worried. And so Mama Duck starts out not worried, and what happens, if you don't know Lucky Ducklings, is that one of the baby ducks falls in a grate as they're out for their walk in the city. And fascinating conversation that a teacher relayed to us about when Mama Duck got worried, and you see they did opt for the minute that the duck fell in the grate, but some of the students were able to say she wasn't worried then. She wasn't worried until she realized that the duck had fallen through the grate. And so, again, really labeling emotion, knowing when it happens, and knowing exactly what it is that causes that change or that character's feeling. Goal setting is another piece of social emotional learning. This is a piece of work right from our Hewlett group of teachers. And here the goal for this particular child was putting forward focused effort all of the time. And on this particular day, he was doing pretty well. But he started out just trying and then was able to have lots of effort. But you could have a goal line, So, and I think this was also one of the things that, talking about effort, that was in our first poll about ways that teachers on this webinar used this particular strategy, the behavior over time graph. Here's children. Another thing I think that the behavior over time graph is so powerful for and so underdone in public schools today is self-assessment. This is a couple examples of students throughout the school year. You see there the x-axis for time is the months of the school year, and really examining their own literacy growth. So how they went from this particular child from not feeling so confident to growing and then feeling very confident at the end. And another child chose to represent her growth by starting out from chapter books, longer chapter books, using more strategies. You see a different pattern of growth, again, with each child having a story to tell. Here's a level of learning graph with the schedule representing the x-axis across the bottom. Days of the week in different colors. And I just want to bring us back to the standard. This is the College and Career Readiness Standard 8 for informational text. So this is what we want students to be able to do. And I think a powerful part of the structure of the standards is that teachers can keep in mind that college and career standard at any point in their instruction. And Standard 8 says that they will delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, as well as the relevance and sufficiency of evidence. And habits of a systems thinker, here you're looking at the big picture, patterns and trends, considering an issue fully, really contribute to students thoughtfully looking for evidence. That was something that teachers in our project told us that they did regularly with their students. This particular habit observes how elements change over time, generating patterns and trends. And again, you see that college and career standard. You see the kinder standard, how it develops into third grade, and how this habit can help students and really can help teachers. It can give them some questions. It can give them some content. I think we have a lot of pedagogies, a lot of strategies that help teachers with content and systems thinking. We believe, and we continue to demonstrate over time, really helps teachers with the strategies for teaching thinking. So there you have, you've seen several examples of habits in the webinar today. But here you see a copy of our habits, and I just do want to mention, Rami mentioned the website and WebEd specifically at the outset of the workshop today, the webinar. But I would really encourage you to go there to look specifically at WebEd Module 2 and another webinar that will be coming on the habits in January. So now we have just a couple of minutes. I really do want to show you some more of the work from our cohort. One of the things that we did in our cohort was we asked teachers to collect some pre and some post work over school year 13-14. And a very common kind of a question that they would ask at the beginning of any school year: what can you learn from a character in the story? And adding that important common core question, how do you know? This is from Click Clack Moo Cows That Type. These are spring samples from students. You see again multiple colored lines, one representing the cows turning into the duck, one representing the farmer, and their level of exasperation, from content to exasperated. I learned that it's okay to trade if someone wants to. I learned that from one of the cows, so that was their evidence. The next example is actually the nonfiction piece, which is just not to be confused. With